All right, I think it's all right. I think we're live now. Can anybody hear me? How is the audio on the audience's end? All right. A few people in the chat. Good. Hello there, biracial boy. Okay. And air smells nice. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Thinking about. All right. A few people there. All right, good. All right, the audio seems to be working. Fantastic. All right, so. All right. Garrett Allen, Sam Patton, good. All right. Getting good. All right. Good responses on the audio. All right. Fantastic. Okay. Well, then let's, I guess want to start off this live stream because, I started because I wanted to do, talk about election stuff. That's what the poll I hosted on the community tab earlier this week. I asked a few topic areas, and most people wanted to talk about 2020 election stuff. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. And before we get into the meat of that stuff, just a reminder to those who haven't seen the today's community tab post, I have posted a link to a Google form for the 2020 Casual Historian Audience Survey. About during late summer, early fall, I usually release a survey in which I tried to get information from my audience in order to help guide my making of videos for the next year. And so if you look at the community tab, as well as in the description of this video, there should be a link to the 2020 audience survey form there. So when you get a chance, you can go ahead and check that out. I'll probably do a live stream later this year analyzing the answers from that. So I guess without much further ado, let's start talking about the election stuff. So any particular questions, or should I start with news or the latest stuff related to it? Let's see. With Twitter open, yeah, it's still a lot of stuff about the New York Attorney General filing the lawsuit against the NRA. All right, another person entering the chat there. Timur Ermolenko. Shalom to you, Timur. All right. Oh, first super chat, Bobby Flay. Do you think black people will get reparations? Well, it depends on what you think of or mean by reparations. Like, if you're talking about like the government giving a payout to them, I don't see that happening. I don't see the government giving an explicit payout to African Americans for this, in remuneration for slavery, especially because, well, fact of the matter is, no African American alive today was ever a slave. And you're going to get a hard time getting a bunch of people who live today who didn't own slaves to pay other people who were not slaves for slavery. That's just been one of the big issues around reparations. Is one of the reasons why they have not tended to go very far, which is why other means of giving special economic privileges or advantages or whatever you want to call it for African Americans has existed over the last 40, 50 years. In the case of like university acceptances, like dang, what's the word? I know this word. I've complained about it before. Affirmative action. Yes, thank you, Timur. Affirmative action. That has been sort of the means by which, different activists have called for giving a kind of reparations for African Americans for slavery. Affirmative action has usually been the usual means. It's the idea that, if you educate the African American population, then they'll become more valuable as workers and whatnot, they'll make more money, and then that'll economically raise them up. That has always been the logic there. However, it has not proven to be a straight line improvement for them. But I'm personally in favor of improving economic opportunities rather than just straight handouts, because I think offering economic opportunities will attract the people who are already have a better work ethic than just those who want money. But that's just my thought on it. See ya. Zane Rossler, what will the 28th Amendment be? I have no idea. People have been talking about the Equal Rights Amendment for many decades now. It's only a few states away, and yet it has not passed. So I have no idea what the 28th Amendment will be. It'll probably be something people don't expect. That's my suspicion anyways. It'll be something we don't expect, and it might be something that's sort of sudden. See, Bobby Flay, why do we pay Indians and Jews? Well, for one, we don't pay Jews. The United States government doesn't pay reparations to Jews. It just doesn't. And we haven't so much paid reparations to individual Indians. We have given money or awarded money in exchange for sort of violated treaties in the past to Indian nations, but we haven't given money to individual Indians, at least not for anything related to reparations. Like the last tribe that held the Black Hills, the place where Mount Rushmore currently is, well, the Supreme Court back in the 1980s actually awarded that tribe a large sum of money that right now is just sitting in a bank waiting for them to accept it, but they haven't because for probably most likely political reasons, they want the land rather than the money. So bottom line, we don't pay reparations to Jews, and we don't pay reparations to individual Native Americans. We've given some money to individual tribes. Otherwise, money received by individual, American Indians is usually in the form of like welfare, which is not unique to them. So yeah, air smells nice. Who do you think will win? Well, if I had to bet money based on what the polls currently say, I would probably guess Joe Biden. But then again, I would have said the same thing back in 2016 when Hillary was also winning. So, gun to my head, I think betting money on politics is not a good idea. But then again, the polls for 2016 weren't wrong. They just looked at nationwide polling rather than individual states. And that's where they messed up. See. So my current bet would be on Joe Biden. As much as I love the meme of Jeb or Kanye West winning, I just don't think it's in the cards realistically. Bobby Flay, affirmative action is for minorities, not specifically black people. You are right. It is not specifically for black people. However, they are the most frequently cited reason for having it. So it's not that others don't benefit from it or can't. It's just that they are sort of the poster child for affirmative action. So that's why they get the most attention for it. See, Lars and Rune, super chat from Lars and Rune. When will we colonize Mars and will life be found there? Well, not explicitly a 2020 election thing, but I have no idea when we'll colonize Mars. If we do find life there, it'll most likely be microorganisms, but I'm not a science guy. That's just my best guess. Yeah, it's like Mars will be colonized sooner when we probably have an economic use for it. Either that or unless like China decides to dump a whole bunch of money into getting into Mars. And even then, it's far more likely to happen quicker if there's some kind of financial use for it. But then again, the space race happened without much financial benefit for it at the time. So who knows? History is funny like that. see. All right. Any thoughts or questions about the election in general or particular? So you got all the Biden stuff, still not sure who his VP is going to be. You know, Kamala Harris is one of those names being floated around. I think Tammy Duckworth was. I'm not sure. See, Bobby Flay. Should Cuomo be the nominee? If by vice presidential nominee, if you mean that, like, I don't think he'd be helpful to the ticket at all. I mean, he's portrayed as doing a good job about coronavirus, but then again, his state got hit harder than anywhere else. And like California has been hit less hard than New York, despite the fact that we have just as many, if not more, direct connections to like China. But then again, it's looking like most coronavirus, coronavirus spread in the United States didn't come directly from China, but rather came from Europe. So, that's probably the reason why it hit the East Coast more than the West Coast. But data still has to come in. It'll be years before we know anything like that. So I don't think Cuomo should or could be the nominee at this point, especially Biden locked himself into, needing to pick a woman. And due to the George Floyd protests earlier this year, he'll probably have to pick someone, a woman of color, to fill that role. Lars and Rune, will there ever be a seriously viable third political party in the U.S.? Not as our political system is currently structured. Since elections require a majority of like electoral votes or majority votes in an individual district to win, or well, depending on where you live, some places it's majority, some other places it's just plurality. But since it's, like that, a third party is going to have a real hard time. You'd have to restructure the American political system quite substantially for a third party to have much of a chance. It's like a third party only exists in the UK out of like sheer determination. And even then, like I think it's the Liberal Democrats in the UK is their big third party. They exist. And even then they're never going to be the prime minister. Their best hope is to be, of course, a spoiler or a kingmaker, depending on how you look at it. See, Sour Castle, will the GOP splinter if Trump loses? That depends on the what a Trump loss looks like, I think. Like, if Trump loses by a very narrow margin, for one, that's probably the worst possibility in this election because, Trump is going to make a big hullabaloo about, this election, it's the results are fraudulent. Now, that doesn't mean Trump's going to somehow hijack the government and remain in office. No, Trump will be out of office on January 20th of next year. That's not the worry. The real worry about Trump denying the election results is mostly for like political civility in the United States. So like if he can convince his whole cadre of supporters that, the election is fraudulent, you can't trust the results, that's bad, I think, for the American civility. So, yeah, I don't think it'll necessarily splinter if he loses. It's like predictions of parties' destructions in the past have always tended to be very not good. They have a bad track record, I have found. Like everyone thought a lot of people thought the Republican Party was dead after Obama won in 2008. And that turned out to not be the case. Trump has just been a weirdly unique figure in that he's disrupted a lot of norms, I think. Let's see. Air smells nice. What books do you recommend for the Franco-Prussian War? I don't know. I haven't done much studying of the Franco-Prussian War, so I'm afraid I cannot recommend any specific books. So you need to find somebody who does more stuff about European history, or at least that kind of stuff in particular. Maybe Armchair Historian. I don't know. He's done more European stuff than me, or at least more war stuff. Let's see. Bobby Flay, do you think Democrats fixed the process to screw over Bernie again? Do I think democracy is coming to an end? No, I don't think the process was fixed against Bernie. In fact, after the 2016 election, the Democratic Party changed their rules specifically for the Bernie people. They wanted to make sure to keep Bernie on their side and prevent, a bunch of Sandinistas from going over to Trump or choosing not to vote in the election again. And so the rules for the 2016 election was simply they were catering to Bernie, and Bernie and his group, his people in the Democratic Party approved of the rules for the election long before it happened. So no, neither the 2016 nor the 2020 nomination was stolen from Bernie. As it turns out, Bernie is just not a national politician. He doesn't have very much appeal outside of that group, I think. And I don't think democracy is coming to an end. I just think it's going to get a lot nastier. Let's see. Hello there, Ancient Accounts. Great to see you here. Favorite historical figure? I have a hard time coming up with a singular thing for that. Just depends on the categories. The good church-going person in me wants to just say Jesus, partly as a means of spreading the gospel, but also just as it's more about, teasing or angering the mythicists when I say that. So, yeah, Jesus just to make certain groups of people angry. If not, I don't know. I had to get back to you on that. I like Calvin Coolidge and George Washington, but it's more for their character than other things. Let's see. Josh Chisholm, do you think we can ever roll back the tide of the ever-growing power of the presidential office? At this point, it would have to, I think, involve first a presidential candidate that actively chooses to not exercise that power and then goes out of their way to reduce the power in whatever way they can. And B, it's going to require Congress to actually reassert its own authority over its purviews of the Constitution. Because the fact of the matter is, Congress gave up, throughout the 20th century, Congress has given up a bunch of its powers and responsibilities over to the executive branch. And that's why this happens. And that's why, the presidential powers have grown so much. See, Michael Krause. Bernie lost because his campaign staff were incompetent and focusing on securing a plurality of voters in a crowded field. Well, here's the thing. I was one of the many people who first thought Bernie didn't have a chance and then thought he was the best chance and then suddenly had no chance. I was one of the many people who thought that. And I guess in 2016, Bernie's biggest benefit was the same as Donald Trump's, in that he was running against Hillary Clinton, the most unpopular Democrat in recent history. And so he benefited from a lot of people who simply didn't like Hillary Clinton voting for him. But this other time around, suddenly there was a bunch of people who weren't Hillary Clinton there. He wasn't the only non-Hillary there in 2020. And something I like to know, and I think I said this on Twitter, but Joe Biden has run for president a bunch of times. And the fact that he has gotten as far as he has is due entirely to the fact that A, he's running against the most unpopular sitting president in the last 30, 40 years. B, the main challenger within his own party was an open socialist who praised, dictators, a recession, and a pandemic that wasn't going too well. Biden has only been successful because of all the stars had to align. And even then, it's still not through yet. So we'll see. We'll see where that goes. Sour Castle. Prediction for the congressional and gubernatorial elections. My guess is that the Democrats will hang on to control of the House. They'll probably take the Senate, and I don't know about gubernatorial races. I haven't checked in on those too much. Lars and Rune, worst American president. For me, it's usually a toss-up between Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In fact, in October, I'm going to be doing a pair of, top 5 and bottom 5 presidents, but that's coming in October, and I don't want to give away too much of that here. So, yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to be keeping my superlatives a little quiet, or at least American presidential superlatives on the down low until then. Let's see. And Lars and Ruined, and why? Well, I'm going to have to keep those secret for now until those videos in October come out. Let's see. Say, Jack, do you think people really want Biden? No, I don't think people want Biden. They just don't want Trump. And here's the thing. Like in 2012, Republicans ran Mitt Romney, and his appeal was mostly that he wasn't Obama. Unfortunately, Republicans are not very good at running a "we are not X" campaign. Or at least they were only really good at that if it's someone like Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was a uniquely bad candidate for the time. So no, they don't want Biden. They just want normalcy back. That's what they want. So Biden very much is a kind of a return to normalcy candidate. Yeah, Warren Harding. He's very much a Warren Harding type, I think, including potential corruption. But that's we're gonna have to wait and see about that. Let's see. Lars and Rune. Let's see. Would you vote for the birthday party or Kanye? I don't know too much about the birthday party, and Kanye only for the memes, similar to Jeb. Let's see. Ancient accounts. I'm from the UK, so hearing a lot of stuff about US politics is really interesting. Oh, thank you. Mostly been in an insular bubble since the Brexit referendum. Yeah, I remember the Brexit referendum. In fact, the results of the Brexit referendum were released I remember seeing those results come in during VidCon 2016. That was something. I didn't see Brexit happening the way it did. And so like 2016 with, Brexit, the election of Trump, all the stuff happening just made me question my ability to predict the future when it comes to politics. Or at least anything short term. I'm just not confident in my predictions there. Let's see, Michael Kraus. You think America would have a stronger democracy if it moved to a parliamentary system? Well, I don't really think so. It's like, I don't think it would make it better or worse. It would just make it, I think, different. Yeah, it would mostly just make it different, I think. In what ways different? That depends on how that individual parliamentary democracy is set up. It's like, is it a system where basically the prime minister can choose to have an election whenever they want, or are they doing what the UK and Canada to an extent have done, where basically that there is a set election cycle unless something major happens, in which case they have to pass legislation to have another election. So depending on the shape of the parliamentary system, it would look different, but not necessarily better or worse. Lindsay Manning, do you believe a third-party candidate can win? I think I answered a similar question earlier, but unfortunately, no. Especially not the third parties here in the U.S., because most of them, the third parties in the U.S. are in this weird situation where it's like, structurally speaking, they're not in a good position to win, and because they're structurally in a bad state, in a state where they can't win, they don't try forming their part. They don't try running, winnable campaigns. It's like, that's why you can have a guy you can just have a big hairy dude stripping live on stage in front of the Libertarian Convention, and they know very well that they're not going to win long before that happens, and then that just secures it. Let's see. Jacob Wilson, if Biden wins, do you think there would be another Tea Party type movement? I don't know. There definitely be some popular movement, but I guess it depends on the situation around Biden's win. Like if Biden wins by like 100 plus electoral votes, that's gonna look really bad for any kind of insurgent political movement. So whether or not a Tea Party movement exists, I don't know. I don't know if the conservatives right now have it in them for another movement like that at the moment. Let's see. What do you think of the attempt by New York Attorney General to dissolve the NRA? How could this affect the 2020 election? Okay, so I don't know the internal mechanisms of the NRA well enough to comment on whether or not that's a legitimate concern. I've heard some people say that, but I question the timing of it. Like the fact that they're going to file this lawsuit right now, right as the election is heating up. To me, it sounds like what they really want to do is divert resources that the NRA might put towards the election towards, defending themselves in court. And so, it'll divert money. The funny thing, though, is that the NRA doesn't actually donate or give that much money in political elections. It's like the NRA donates far less than any other, like, say, Planned Parenthood gives a lot more money in political donations than the NRA does, as do teachers' unions. They are far more influential in terms of money in politics than the NRA. So I think filing a lawsuit against them I think it's just going to be bad. It's going to rally a bunch of people to their defense, and it's not going to impact the election too much money wise, because the Republican Party has never actually been dependent upon money from the NRA. The NRA is far more powerful, is far more influential in getting Republicans out of office than it is actually getting them elected, surprisingly enough. Like in Republican primaries, an NRA endorsement is more powerful than their money. That's a big thing you got to learn about the local level Republican politics. They're more powerful as a signaling group. So yeah, I think it's more based in politics. I think the targeting of the NRA by the Attorney General in New York is more based on politics than it is on anything that the NRA is actually doing in terms of money stuff. I think they're just, at best, this is like getting Al Capone for tax evasion at best for them. Butter Pickman, do you live in US or Canada? I live in the USA in the California Central Valley. That's about as specific as I usually get nowadays. I live in the place that grows all the almonds and is draining the aquifer. Say, Jack, how long do I think democracy will last? No idea. I have no idea. That's hard to say. We haven't found, it's like, what did Winston Churchill say? It's like, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So I can't say. So yeah, Mike McSimic. What do you think of this money printing and zero interest rate? And could it have an effect on the election? Well, in the US, we don't quite have a 0% interest rate yet. Other countries have done that, and it's the results are mixed. The problem with the money printing idea and this sort of quantitative easing type idea of getting the economy to move again is that once you start printing the money, it gets really hard to stop. Let's see. All right, Josh Cheesem, only using political outsiders. Who would be your dream ticket for 2020? Only political outsiders? Gosh, I don't know. I've become far more weary of political outsiders in the last 4 years. It's like, and defining what a political outsider is kind of hard because, like, before 2016, Trump was considered a political outsider. But by winning the election, he suddenly becomes a political insider. I mean, can you really call yourself a political outsider if you're in the White House? So that's kind of a difficult question. So I have no idea at this point. I probably would have had more answers a few years ago, but now I become less certain of that. Nabucodonosor, ancient ruler named the second. What's your opinion on the Trump presidency? I think he's been unnecessarily divisive, and he's accomplished, and none of the positive things he accomplished couldn't have been done by a more qualified person that he ran against in 2016. The only thing he may have done that others wouldn't have is moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. That's, I think, the only thing he's done that the other Republican candidates wouldn't have done better. All right. Lindsey Manning, who do you think would be the Republican nominee if Clinton won in 2016? Well, that depends on how people have reacted. You know, like, it depends on who reacted. I think Trump would even be a candidate, or at least he would have run for the nomination. Don't know how well he would have done, considering he lost last time. But again, it's hard to say. It's hard to say there. See, all right, Medrano again. Eduardo Rodriguez Medrano. Do you think the endorsement and defense of riots and Chaz will affect the Democrats' popularity? I honestly don't think it will, or at least it won't hurt them where they already have power. Like, it's like in cities like Portland, San Francisco, New York, DC, the actions of, giving defense of riots or these occupied zones, it won't affect the Democrats where they're strongest and where these things are actually happening. So I don't think they're in too much worry there. And unfortunately, Trump is so divisive that he's turning sort of the swing areas of the United States, which are the suburbs, away from him. College-educated white women is the one they're usually looking at, the old defense moms under George W. Bush. It's like he scares them away, and those are the swing votes of the United States right now. See, Lars and Rune, do you believe in the Electoral College in presidential elections? I believe in it, but I don't like the way it's currently running, because the problem with the Electoral College right now, I think, is that it's actually too democratic. The Electoral College, the electors in the Electoral College used to be selected by state legislatures. However, over time, it became more and more democratic, but not democratic enough. So that's why the current Electoral College is kind of the worst of both worlds. It's not democratic enough to satisfy those who want direct democracy, and it's too democratic to function the way it was intended to. So the reason the Electoral College has the problems it is now is simply because we wanted to make it more democratic, but didn't want to get rid of it entirely. So, the idea of the Electoral College was basically to elect a temporary parliament who would then elect a president. That was the idea behind it. But it was hard to get people to continue going on with that, because there's a bunch of stuff. I have a video I want to make about the Electoral College before the election, so I'm going to save a lot of my thoughts for there. But that's an area of thought I have. Sour Castle, do you think Biden's free trade policies won't fare well, especially after the COVID-19 recession, changing the supply lines? Well, Biden in the last couple months has actually been sort of having a muddled position on trade. He's been definitely pushing lately a more Buy American thing as a kind of a sop to the unions. Unions are an old Democratic Party power base. And so I think he might actually have a very similar economic policy to Donald Trump, but the main difference being that he's in favor of a higher ceiling on the progressive income tax. So I think that'll be the main difference between a Biden and Trump economic policies. Let's see here. What do you think will be the most important voting bloc in the presidential election? Oh, I think it's, suburban white women. That is seems to be the deciding voter bloc of the last 4 to 10 years now. It's like wherever suburban white women think the country is going too bad, or if they think the president is too crass, they'll vote for the other party. That they've seemed to have been the deciding vote for, well, yeah, even the last 20 years, you could argue. And so that's why you hear a lot of like Republican talk people. Like I listen to a lot of podcasts and they all talk about, how the Republicans losing the suburbs is like the worst thing for them in an election, because there's not enough people. Like Republicans dominate the rural areas in the United States and Democrats dominate the urban. The urban population in the United States outnumbers the rural. And so the Republicans have only been able to win elections when they unite the rural and the suburbs. So that's how that's going on. So it's the suburbs are the vote to look for. They're the deciding vote in most elections right now. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Say, Jack, I do not think we'll get rid of the Electoral College unless, once again, I'd say unless we have like 2 elections in a row where the popular vote doesn't reflect the Electoral College, we won't get rid of it. And so there is a narrow window in which Trump can win this November. That narrow window is that a bunch of, mail-in votes get tossed out, and not because of any conspiracy theory, but mostly because like clerical errors. Because like when people fill out a vote by mail ballot, there are lots of little things that have to be exactly right, or else the ballot gets thrown out. And so like in these recent elections in New York, like a total of I think maybe a quarter of votes were tossed out. Multiply that by a nationwide election, and you could see if enough votes get tossed out in the right places, and the places that are using more vote by mail are a lot of swing states and a lot of heavily Democrat states. A lot of those votes get thrown out. And so if Trump manages to squeak out a victory in the Electoral College because a bunch of votes had to get thrown out because of clerical errors, and that results in Trump squeaking out a victory in the Electoral College, but still losing in the popular, that I think could be a death knell for the Electoral College, as if it throws off 2 elections in a row, especially for the same guy. See, the One Hawks fan, who do you think Libertarian Republicans can become? Or maybe you think how? How do you think Libertarian Republicans can become prominent again, like in 2014? Well, Trump has to go away. That's one. Unfortunately, Trump has, like any leader, when a party controls the White House, the president, the president becomes the de facto leader of that party. And because of that, he sucks away a lot of oxygen. And so while Trump has been in the White House, he has forced a bunch of Republicans down ticket to try and appease him, or more correctly, appease Trump's voters. And so that has been a big issue. And Democrats had a similar issue involving Barack Obama when he was president. They had to appease the Obama voters, people who wanted to vote for Obama. However, I think it might be a bigger issue with Trump, but I don't know. Michael Morosky, when do you think the dollar to euro rate will stabilize? I have no idea. I have not paid too much attention to euro rates. Jacob Wilson, what is the most important political issue to you? See, well, I have to separate in my head political from moral issues. And then there's a intersection between the two. I'd say the most important political/moral issue for me would be something like abortion. Like I said this in the last live stream, and I'll say it again here. There are practical arguments for abortion, but I do not think there are any convincing moral arguments. Like, there's no world in which you can say that an unborn child, having the life of an unborn child be ended for no reason other than the mother thinks it's an inconvenience, is a moral good. You can argue it's practical, but there's no world in which you can argue that it's morally good. And that's the position, that's the issue I try to bring up to people, is at least to accept this dichotomy, practical versus moral. So I think abortion is one of the biggest moral issues of our time. Most important political issue at the moment, to me, Trump isn't the most important political issue to me, but I think it is sort of the de facto most important political issue right now, simply because everything is oriented around him. And so until he's gone, it's kind of hard for politics to go back to normal. And even then, not even certain if it will. David Davidson asks, do you think the Democrats screwed over Bernie by having Buttigieg and Klobuchar drop out of the race? No, actually. It's here's the thing. Dropping out of the race out of potential promises for like being on the ticket or positions in the cabinet, that's kind of the most old-fashioned campaign tools ever. It's like Joe Biden is running probably the most old-fashioned political campaign we have seen in a long time. You know, it's like he doesn't care about Twitter or social media. You know, he doesn't care about all that stuff. And so he's running a very old-fashioned campaign, you know, a front porch campaign, or probably more accurately, a basement campaign, but it seems to be working for him at the moment. See, Lindsay Manning, do you think there is a reason why this is not talked about often in reference to Trump ran for president in the year 2000? I don't think it's talked much about because he wasn't too serious of a contender then. You know, he just wasn't that serious of a contender. That's why. You know, it was just considered back then just that, you know, like media hungry Donald Trump just acting wacky again. You know, like JJ McCullough made a great video related to that recently. So yeah, when talking about The Simpsons predicting the future, it's a great video to go watch it. It's one of his more recent ones, I think. Sour Castle, will I ever open a Discord? Well, opening a Discord is one of the milestones on my Patreon, but I actually asked a question about Discord in the Casual Historian 2020 audience survey, which is linked down in the description below, as well as on the community tab. It's a survey where I ask the audience questions, get some demographic data that I can't get from YouTube, as well as get some insights into what the audience might want to see in the future. So if you want to have your voice heard about something like a Discord server, there's a question about it in the audience survey down in the description below. All right. All right. Gum Duquin. All right. Would you say it's important for youngsters to go out and vote? If you already answered this, sorry, you just got here. All right. Hello. Well, is it important for youngsters to go out and vote? I used to be one that thought the most important part of politics was voting. You know, it's like I was involved in my local community college's chapter of the College Republicans. One of the biggest things we did at every event was voter registration, you know, get people out to vote. I was always of the mindset that, politics is, you know, young people are involved because they're apathetic about politics, which is true. But I've grown more and more to think that voting is probably the least important part of politics. That's a crazy thing to say, but I think far more important than voting is becoming sort of a politically literate. You know, it's like you need to know the basics of civics, know how the government works, and not in a conspiracy way, but the actual mechanics of government. You know, basic civic stuff that you should have learned in high school, but sometimes they're not doing a super good job of that. Or it's just that we as individuals don't care much about it once we get out of school. So I'd say the most important thing for youngsters to do is to get informed and become, you know, knowledgeable citizens. Voting is the very last step of politics. And that is sort of my final word. Voting is the last step. Biracial Bay Boy, you are back. Well, welcome back. So you have another question there. I'll get to it in just a moment. Rich Culver, as it would require an amendment, I doubt many small states will back an elimination of the Electoral College, and even some big ones like Texas. You are probably right. That's why I doubt. As a kid, it's one of these things where it would require an amendment, but I would say it's something that could happen if, the push was big enough. And you usually need some big political impetus, such as, the same guy winning the White House twice because of the Electoral College, even though he lost the popular vote. Yeah. All right. What was that question you had, Biracial Boy? What do you think would have happened if Trump won the 2000 election? Well, in order to do that, Trump would have had to run for one of the two major parties. So he would have had to have run either as a Republican or a Democrat. And I don't know at the top of my head what was the most recent registration Trump had at the time, because Trump has jumped back and forth between the two. I know Trump was a Democrat during most of the Bush years, so there is a chance he could have run as a Democrat in 2000, but that would have meant having to challenge, Al Gore for the party's nomination. And I doubt he would have beaten Al Gore in the Democratic Party primaries. So, yeah. So I don't think there's no world in which Trump could have won in 2000. See, gum again. What's sad for me is I didn't too scared towards Trump being in power. I'm no supporter if I just didn't frighten by until he pulled the troops out of Turkey. All right, I'll let you rephrase that a little later. So, Nusantara Rising. Have you followed the split in the American Muslim community between Yaqeen Institute, Reformist, and the Traditionalists? How will this affect Islam Progressive Alliance? I have not followed this split. I am not too familiar about the about these questions within the American Muslim community. Unfortunately, that is one area I am not too well informed in, so I'm going to have to change that at some point. Unfortunately, I haven't paid too much attention to the Muslim community in the United States because it is rather small community and doesn't seem to be large enough in too many places to swing the vote. The Muslim community is large enough in certain individual localities to swing like a state assembly race or like a congressional vote, but it hasn't been large enough to swing a national election. So, except for places like where some of the squad members get elected from, they're not too an influential of a voting bloc at this point. Brit Boy, if you had to vote for Trump or Biden, who would you vote for? Oof. Well, I live in California, and California is going to go for Biden, no matter what else happens. Like, Biden could come out during one of the presidential debates and openly say, I am a supporter of ISIS. I openly endorse the policies of ISIS, every last one of them. And California would still go for Joe Biden. So it doesn't really matter how I vote. He's getting the state I live in. Mike McSimic. What hurts Biden more, to debate Trump or not? Well, it depends. I mean, the Trump campaign and a lot of the Trump supporters have been pushing this whole idea that Biden is mentally unsound. And because of that, they've sort of lowered the expectations of him. And since the expectations of Biden are so low, all he has to do is rise above those expectations, and suddenly it looks like he won the debate. What you usually want to do is to hype up your opponent's debating skills before a debate and then see them fall way short of that. And that way it makes it look like you've won. So whether or not it's good or bad for Biden the debates is depending upon the strategy. Right now, I think actually Biden could do pretty well, mostly because the Trump team has been lowering people's expectations of him so much. So he can very easily jump that hurdle, I think. Lindsay Manning, what to you are the most notable elections in U.S. history and the least notable? I don't think I can have a least notable election because, well, it's least notable for a reason. Most notable, 1824s were fairly notable, mostly because you had like a 4-person race, and it was like one of the first. It was the second election, I think, to be settled by Congress. The House of Representatives had to settle the election of 1824, which was the first election where people called for, the abolishment of the Electoral College afterwards. All right. Oh, okay. A bunch of extra questions here. All right. See, Garrett Allen, at the beginning of the election cycle, if you had to guess, who would you have guessed would the Democrats have picked as the most likely contender to Trump? At the beginning of the election cycle, I was very much in the Biden camp when it comes to who I thought would probably win the nomination. Then Biden did terribly in like the first 4 primaries, and then he suddenly did well. So my bet at the beginning would have been Biden, and then like everyone else, I dropped him for Bernie as a guessing game. And then, of course, I had to regret at the end because when Biden had the South Carolina firewall, which definitely helped him out a lot. So yeah, Biden would have been the most likely contender. All right. Benjamin in the chat. Hello there. Hello to you, Benjamin. Jacob Wilson, do you think the idea of left and right libertarians uniting is practical? Not really. Like, I have a hard time in my head wrapping my head around the idea of like libertarian socialists, mostly because socialism can't really be enforced without kind of a top-down power structure. It's like people can voluntarily live together in a socialist commune if they want, but the problem with most socialist communes, as you look through history, is that they don't survive long, and it's not because some outside power comes in and crushes them. Most communes fail because individuals within the commune leave the commune because it sucks to live in the commune. Life is better outside of it. There are people living in there who don't want to work and whatnot. Like, there's this famous story you hear conservatives talk about all the time, how Bernie Sanders, like in the 60s or 70s, got kicked out of a commune because he didn't want to work. He just wanted to talk about socialism all the time. And so, yeah. That's the thing. It's a neat story. Republicans will repeat it all the time about Bernie. Unfortunately, though, Bernie is, I think, running his relevance in politics is running low at this point. All right. Gum. Would you say Trump made a big mistake in pulling the troops, which led Turkey to intervene with the Kurds? Well, here's the thing. The troops haven't actually been pulled out of Syria. U.S. troops are still in Syria. They're still in sort of the Turkish part of Syria. And they're the ones sort of protecting the oil at that time right now. And so was it a bad policy? He definitely could have done a much better job with it. Like, there are philosophical and practical arguments for withdrawing American forces from Syria and much of the world. But Trump just sort of did it really haphazardly, or at least he would have done it had, there not been such a big public backlash. So, yeah, that's sort of my thoughts there. Is that there's a good way to do it, and the way Trump was trying to do it was not a good way to do it. Benjamin, do you think Bernie Sanders would have had a better chance if he ran his own party or as an independent instead of staying as a Democrat? Bernie Sanders has only done as well as he had because he ran it as a Democrat. That's, it's like third parties just don't have an electoral chance in the United States right now. That one Hawks fan, favorite / least favorite senators from each party. See, for the Republicans, gosh, my favorite list for the Republicans has gotten really short. I still like Cruz, but unfortunately, he's compromised too much with Trump. At least in terms of individual character, I think Mitt Romney is probably my favorite Republican senator right now. And my least, God, I have no idea. I have no idea who my least is. I'd have to look more into it. Over the last 4 years, I've disconnected more from politics than I had at any point prior to me becoming a registered voter. It's just been so depressing. And for the Democrats, senators from the Democratic Party, they're just, I don't know. The bar for them is already so low in my head. But, yeah, Kamala Harris rubs me the wrong way, like she does a lot of people. Kamala Harris, just everything about her feels fake. So I guess, I can name one favorite from the Republicans and I can name one least favorite from the Democrats at the moment. So Nusantara Rising. Queen. Okay, giving a bit of an explanation for some of the stuff. Okay, yeah. All right. I'll have to take a look at those again later to look more into it. Bob Joe, is Biden too centrist or too pro status quo? Is it a bad thing in general? I don't think being a centrist or status quo is inherently bad, but I also don't think Biden is a centrist or a status quo kind of guy. Biden is considered a centrist within the Democratic Party. He's not a centrist in terms of like the entire American electorate. That is something I think a lot of people don't really understand there. Okay, let's see. All right. Ancient name of ruler II. What, in your opinion, is the worst outcome possible in the 2020 election? The worst outcome possible is a very narrow Trump victory. Or, I think a narrow Trump victory is probably the worst, followed by a narrow Trump defeat. So Gum, little off topic. Were you kind of concerned that Biden's eyeball burst? I actually kind of freaked out. I have not seen the eyeball burst thing. And I have no idea. I haven't seen the eyeball burst thing. I don't follow the daily election drama too much. I just follow the bigger trends that are going on. Lindsay Manning, do you believe California will one day vote for a Republican again? And do you think it's possible for states like Wyoming will vote for Democrat in the future? Well, it depends on sort of the policies they adopt over time. Like, say, if the Republican Party, like right now at the convention, decided to adopt into their platform, like we'll grant amnesty to all illegal immigrants and grant citizenship to all, persons living in the United States illegally. If they did that, that still wouldn't shift the vote of immigrants in the United States towards the Republican Party, at least not right away. It takes a while for different voter blocks to shift party. Like African Americans in the United States used to vote for Republicans, and the story around that, usually most people say, oh, then in 1964, 65, Lyndon Johnson got the Civil Rights Act passed, and then they started voting Democrat. But the trend of African Americans voting for Democrats started long before that. It started like in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when people needed jobs, and in some places the New Deal programs offered African Americans jobs, and so they started moving towards the Democratic Party back then. And the transition only finished after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 65. I can't remember in my head which year it was. And so whether or not a state like California can move could vote for a Republican again depends on what Republicans do. So it basically depends on Republicans becoming more left-wing and or Democrats becoming more right-wing. See ya. Medrano, what happened with congressional caucuses? Tuesday Group and Blue Dog Coalition. Are those groups going out? They seem to have less members than ever. Caucuses are still a thing. They're still a thing, but at least in the Trump years, they've mattered less than sort of the personalities of the leaders of the different parties. Like within the Republican Party, like caucuses matter. Caucuses seem to matter more for the parties that are out of power than the ones that are in power. When the party's in power, the two de facto caucuses tend to be, those who go along with the leader of the party and those who don't. Let's see here. Lindsey Manning again. Who do you think will be Biden's VP choice? Well, I think it was last week. There were a number of accidentally published articles that were saying it was Kamala Harris. And one of the possibilities I think around that would have been people at those different news outlets have connections inside the campaigns. They asked the campaigns, and then someone in the campaign either leaked an actual choice or leaked a possible choice. And that's how the Kamala Harris name got thrown around. Either that or the other more conspiracy type possibility there is that the Biden campaign intentionally leaked the Kamala Harris choice to certain media outlets to see how people would react to it, and then judge whether or not to take her based on their reaction. And as it turns out, most people were unenthusiastic about Kamala Harris. I mean, picking Kamala Harris would just be a very easy way for the Democrats to just sort of rake up, just rack up additional popular votes in states like California, which is what happened last time. California gave a whole bunch of extra votes to Hillary Clinton last time, and that's kind of why the election turned out the way at least that's why the popular vote turned out the way it did. All right, Gum. Would you say the Whigs would be a good choice in this election since they were usually not left, right, nor centrist in general? The problem with the Whigs and trying to talk about 19th century political parties, especially in the U.S., is that 19th century American political parties don't fit neatly onto the left-right paradigm of modern politics. They just don't fit neatly into that. So I don't know if the Whigs would. The Whigs have a very protectionist economic policy. And right now the Democrats are more free trade than they've ever been. Bob Joe, if Trump doesn't recognize the vote, is there legal recourse that Trump can pursue? Can he ask Barr to stall or do something in the courts? The only legal recourse is basically both parties already lined up a bunch of lawyers to sue in a bunch of different states in case the elections don't go the way they want. So there's going to be some kind of legal battle. Just a matter of how successful legal battles will be is going to depend a lot on what does the election look like on election night? Say if Biden is blowing out Trump 10 plus points in most states, then it'll probably go to him very easily. But it's going to depend partly on what the election results look like on election night. But we're probably not going to know the results for election night just due to all of the mailed-in ballots that are going to be coming in this year, considering how long it's taking states like New York to count their own votes at the moment for just a few congressional elections. So past the general lawsuits that will happen after the election, there's not much Trump or Attorney General Barr can do to stall anything in the courts. There's not much they really can do, because The election is resolved ultimately by the Electoral College. And so when the electors meet in December, they will vote and decide. Let's see. Jason Chalafor. Jason name. What would need to happen for Congress to reassert its authority and to try to curb executive power? Well, Congress has passed legislation throughout the years that gave the executive branch those powers. So what Congress would need to do was they would need to pass legislation to undo those laws. And they would either need to have a president in office who was sympathetic to that, or they would need to have a large enough majority in Congress to do it. The problem, however, is that congressmen don't like making controversial votes that they think will make them lose an election, which is why they've passed off many of the regulations, decision making to the executive branch, so they can say, "Oh, well, it's the president's fault this happened. The law we passed didn't have this stuff. The president is just abusing his power. So I guess you guys just need to donate more money to our elections. That way we can win the next time." That's what both parties do. They avoid making tough decisions on this stuff. And because so much of the regulation and rules making power is held in the executive branch, we've also taken away a bunch of budget from congressman offices, because like beforehand, congressional offices used to have fairly big budgets in which they could hire, professionals and experts and researchers to look up stuff in order to craft policy for legislation. But after they passed those powers off to the executive branch, those budgets ended up getting cut, because it's like, well, do you guys really need these big staffs to do research into legislative issues if you guys actually aren't crafting legislative regulations? And that's how it ended up happening. Congress lost its power because it voluntarily gave it up. And so you would need to have a Congress that wanted its power back and a president who was willing to give it back. That's really hard to do. Britboy, thoughts on gun laws? Depends on what the gun law is. Most gun laws tend to be about restricting your right to own them or have them on your person, and so I tend to be against them. See, Rich Culver, I think the campaign was floating names to check responses. Yeah, that's definitely a possibility, considering that after that happened, the Biden campaign that said, nope, we're gonna have to wait another week to announce it. We have to wait another week. So that's what makes me think that might have been what was going on. But once again, we won't know until after the election's over if that was what was happening. Let's see. Do you think that the Chinese are a danger to America? I don't think they're a danger long term. China is a much bigger danger to its neighbors and to its own people than it is to the United States. It's like there's the maybe genocide of Uyghurs going on in China. We don't know. It's kind of secretive there. So it might be a genocide, or at the very least, China seems to be engaging in a cultural genocide of the Uyghurs. So yeah, that's a thing. China's a bigger danger to its own people than they are to us to the United States at the moment. Lindsey Manning, if Sanders somehow got the nomination, who do you think would be his VP choice? If Sanders had won the nomination, he would definitely need to pick a woman who was younger than him. Though Sanders is less concerned with the gender and race part of the whole, race, gender, class triangle that the modern intersectional left is concerned with, he would still probably pick a female running mate and someone who is younger than him. It's like for a time people thought that could be Elizabeth Warren, but who knows? Democrats have a tendency to do a ticket balancing thing where they'll have, if like one, like if the person in the top part of the ticket is from the north, they'll pick someone from the south. But then again, regional based tickets have been losing their power for like a long time now, and they don't seem to have much strength. Like I remember back in 2012 when Romney was chosen to be the Republican candidate, and then he picked Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan didn't win the Republicans' Wisconsin back in 2012. And Romney on the ticket didn't win the Republicans' Massachusetts or Michigan. So that seems to have less power than ever before. So no idea who Sanders would have chosen to be his VP. Let's see. And Benjamin asks, in Florida, we're having an amendment on our ballot to have top 2 open primaries. Do you think election outcomes in general would change if all states ran these types of elections? P.S. Please break me out of Florida. Well, I can tell you now that California has a top 2 open primary system, and we've had one since 2011. And it won't change the election results too much, I think. It didn't change them too much in California. The most that's happened is that there are a few like congressional districts in California where you had 2 Democrats running, and then like maybe 1 or 2 that had 2 Republicans running in November. But otherwise, it doesn't change the outcome too much. It's like the places that had 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats running against each other were areas where where their respective party usually ran double digits ahead of their competitors in the November general elections. So it won't change too much of what's going on, I think. Plus, I can't help you there in Florida. You're stuck there. All right. Bob Joe, can you please explain why in the United States mail-in voting is not susceptible to fraud as much as some Republicans and Trump are trying to claim? Well, the biggest concern with mail-in voting, I would say, isn't fraud, though there is potential there, but it's mostly theoretical potential. Like the potential for fraud in mail-in voting is similar to like the potential of like ISPs throttling, bandwidth from like competitors. Like the whole net neutrality debate was based around this hypothetical idea that the ISPs will throttle the internet activity of people trying to access stuff that they have a competing product for, like saying, oh, they'll throttle Netflix, like Comcast or AT&T would throttle Netflix in order to encourage you to use their service instead of Netflix. But there's not really much evidence that anything like that has ever actually happened. It's a theoretical problem that never came to fruition before or after the brief 2.5 years that net neutrality was in place. Well, the voter fraud by mail is very similar to that, in that there are hypothetical scenarios in which you could get voter fraud, and there are individual like stories of similar stuff happening, like say a party activist going door to door in a neighborhood that has a lot, like going door to door in like say a lower class neighborhood, registering people to vote and making sure that they vote by mail, and then coming around again around election time when the ballots have been mailed out, going up to these same homes and asking them, hey, I'll pay you $50 for your ballot. Like there's been a story or 2 like that. And so it's theoretically possible, but there's not really a high enough statistical chance of it happening. And if it is, it's not happening on a large enough scale to be effective. And so it's, like I said, it's similar to net neutrality. It's a hypothetical problem, but there's not really enough evidence to prove that it's a huge problem. The much bigger issue when it comes to voting by mail is simply that votes sent in by mail get counted a lot slower and a lot later than votes sent in on election day. And that is the biggest problem with vote by mail. That and what I mentioned before, in that it's very, very finicky when you fill out your mail-in ballot, in that, oh, the chick, you missed something. You filled something out incorrectly, and then the election officials have to throw your ballot out for clerical errors. That's the biggest actual problem involving mail-in voting right now, is because we simply don't have the infrastructure to handle it at high capacities at the moment. Okay, Bob Joe, 10 pounds. Thank you for everything you were doing. I appreciate it. Well, thank you, Bob Joe, for your you and your Brit Bucks there. Yes, I very appreciate you. So yes, that is the issue with mail-in voting. It's like fraud is more of a hypothetical issue than an actual one. The bigger issue is mostly just not having the ability to actually handle the extra load that would happen in a year like this. All right. Gum Gum Dukin, would you say the U.S. has lost a lot of influence ever since 2010 or somewhere before the 2000s? I've heard this talked about a bunch, but I'm not sure. Well, it depends on what areas you're thinking. Like, economically, the U.S. is still pretty strong, and we've probably handled the economic stuff better than most. But then again, we had a lot of leeway to work with. So it's more accurate to say it's not so much the U.S. has lost influence as much as that it's lost prestige over the last 10, 20 years. That's, I think, is more accurate to say it's a loss of prestige. Lindsay Manning, does Washington, D.C. have a chance of becoming a state soon? If the Democrats win control of the Senate, there's actually if the Democrats win control of the Senate and Biden wins the presidency, there is actually a fairly high likelihood that that'll make it through Congress. There's a pretty high chance of that, I think, actually. Recently, Congress, the House of Representatives recently passed a bill calling for DC statehood. Now, they knew it wouldn't pass through either the Senate or be signed by President Trump. But the fact that they're already doing it shows that there's at least a willingness. Now, of course, the question would then have to be, will they have the guts to pull the trigger when time comes? Similar to like how during the Obama years, Republicans passed a bunch of bills in the House of Representatives to abolish the Affordable Care Act. But when they finally had control of both houses of Congress and the presidency, they couldn't get a piece of legislation like that through. So I guess we'll have to see if it's something like that. But it seems more likely, I think, than not at the moment. Bob Joe, China is trying to control countries through loans and infrastructure projects, such as the Belt and Road. Is it a valid concern, flipping U.S. allies due to the fact that the Chinese might control ports? It's a concern, but once again, I think China is far less internally stable than it looks from the outside. There's a lot of stuff here. I talked about it in a much older video that I think it's still public, but it's from like back in 2014. I released this video, a video called like Connecting the Dots to China, Japan, and the American Empire, something like that. I talked about a bunch of stuff there. So it's a concern, but it's also very expensive for China to fund these projects. Let's see. All right. Ancient ruler number 2. Do you think that the economic recession can revive socialism movements around the globe, or is socialism totally dead? No, it's not dead. It always comes back. It's like I remember like there's a quote from I think it's a clip or a quote from Ronald Reagan where he's saying, kids aren't born with freedom, isn't something you're genetically born with, It's something that has to be reaffirmed every generation. And so basically there's always going to be a new generation of young kids for whom socialism sounds like this new cool thing that's never been talked about or tried before. And that's why politics never goes away. That's why certain issues will just never die. There's always a new person who hasn't heard of it before. Brit Boy, thoughts on Puerto Rico or DC statehood? I'm more supportive of Puerto Rican statehood than I am of DC. Puerto Rico, I am all in favor of Puerto Rico deciding for itself whether or not it becomes a state or if it wants to become an independent country. DC, on the other hand, there's not really a point. The only point in giving DC statehood would be to give the Democrats 2 additional seats in the Senate that they don't have to compete for. It's just 2 free additional seats. I would much rather have the residential areas of DC just be given back to Maryland, because DC used to be twice as big in terms of landmass as it is now, but we gave the half south of the Potomac River back to Virginia. So we could just as easily give all the residential areas of DC back to Maryland, and that would give them the representation that they want. But of course, that's not what the Democrats want. The Democrats want DC as a state because it'll give them 2 extra seats in the Senate, and it's free senators, basically. They don't have to compete for them. It'll be a lot like California. They outnumber Republicans there. In fact, even more than California. It's like 10-1 in DC. So yeah, I'm a little cynical about the DC statehood thing. Puerto Rico, a little more sympathetic too. The Democrats want it for similar reasons, but there's already, I guess those are just my feelings on it. Let Puerto Rico do what it wants. DC, just give it back to Maryland. All right. Gum. With Brexit becoming a thing and supposedly Japan is becoming more nationalist, would you say nationalism is making a comeback throughout the globe, Ireland included? Well, kind of. The problem with nationalism is that nationalism means something different depending on where you are. Like JJ McCullough, again, he has actually a very interesting video about this, about Canadian nationalism, which is actually very left-wing or progressive, however you want to define that end of the political spectrum, and that nationalism means something different depending on where you are. Nationalism in the UK tends to also be very monarchist, but nationalism in the United States is very anti-monarchist. So it doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. Also, nationalism tends to be growing, especially in places that used to be former colonies. That's like Eastern Europe, much of Africa, East Asia, lots of nationalism there because those areas are former colonies. And and for Eastern Europe, they were dominated first. They were dominated first by the Russian Empire, then by the Soviets, then by the Nazis, then by the Soviets. So, it's places that had their sovereignty taken away from them are the places that are seeing the most nationalism right now. Or places that think that have had their sovereignty taken away from them, like the UK. See, Rich Culver should give Hawaii the option to go back to being a country before statehood to the federal district. If that's a way of saying no, then yes. Unfortunately, I have to look at the demographics of Hawaii, but I don't think the native ethnic Hawaiian population is big enough to want to vote for that or to win a vote for that, especially if they had to, especially if, Anglo-Hawaiians were also given a vote. I support, Hawaii becoming an independent country in the same way that I support any other state wanting to secede, as in I support the right to do so. I just don't necessarily support them politically. All right, Bob Joe, would it be possible to only exclude the few miles of government buildings from Washington, D.C. statehood in order to comply with the Constitution? Are there bills that have this concept? I don't know if there are any bills out there with this concept, but it's something that can already be done. It's like here's the thing. In every state in the U.S. and the western you go, you'll find that there's plenty of federal property. It's like in the state of California, there's a bunch of federal property here, federal land, federal departments that have their own buildings in which they operate from in other states. It could be very easily just like that. The only exception is that the seat of the national government should be on its own land. At least that's how it was phrased in the Constitution and in the original law. And so it's very easy to do. It's very doable. There's just sort of not the political will to do it. Lindsay Manning, how do you think the 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s will be taught in schools and remembered for? I can't tell you what the 2020s will be like. The 2000s and the 2010s, I think, will be remembered as a transitionary period, similar to how the first 20 years of the 20th century were. 1900 and 1920 is looked at as this transitionary period. It's like the turn of the century is the phrase. The turn of the century is usually in reference to like the first 20 years of a century. And so, 2010, 2000s and 2010s, that's the turn of the 21st century. We are now at the end of that turn. And so I think it'll be seen as most similar times are in that it's a transitionary period. Christian Vibrecht, welcome. Just tuned in. Do you believe that if Trump loses the election, most Republicans will pretend to have never liked him? More so will do that than will get away with it. And the thing is that there's this group out there called like the Lincoln Project, and they're trying to have this sort of scorched earth political strategy, and basically they want to kind of decimate the Republican Party to the point where it's a rump party. And the problem with that kind of strategy is if you want to burn down everything because Donald Trump was associated with the party, the most Trumpiest elements of the party will be what survives any kind of, scorched earth strategy against the Republican Party. It's like the people who are least supportive of Trump within the Republican Party will all be voted out of office. And what you'll have left is a very Trumpy rump core for it. And so I find that's kind of a bad idea. And so, yes, they will disassociate. Some will try to disassociate themselves from it, but there's a Trumpiest element within the party now. And so it's going to depend on what Trump does. Like if Donald Trump, against his nature and instincts, decides to go just quietly into the night after the election, which I think is the best option for him, or at least it'd be the best thing for the country. He won't do it, but it would be the best option for the country. Then I think you could see a lot of Republicans just decide, okay, we're putting the Trumpy past behind us. But there will be plenty of people who won't let them get away with it. So that's a big mess. It's going to be a mess. Like if people think politics are suddenly going to get a lot cleaner after Trump is gone, they haven't been paying attention, I think. Let's see. All right. Diggs. There's a lot of different forms of Canadian nationalism. You got the lefty nationalists, but then you got the old pro-British nationalists who are for close ties to the crown. Yeah, I'm familiar with them as a thing, but my familiarity with Canadian nationalism is mostly contained to whatever J.J. McCullough has said about it. And so I get the British nationalist kind of Canadian nationalism exists, but my understanding is that there's some kind of association with them and like some racist stuff, but I'm not entirely certain. I have to look more into Canadian politics to understand that. Let's see. Bob Joe, is nationalism or extreme right a threat to the European Union? I definitely thought it was at the beginning of like 2017. It's like they definitely, I thought it was more of a threat a few years ago than it is now. The biggest threat to the European Union as a bloc is mostly, I think, between the richer countries and the poorer countries. So you have like France that's leading these countries that are less fiscally conservative, and you have Germany leading the countries that are more more fiscally conservative. France wants to have a more expansionary monetary policy as a means of trying to spur growth, while Germany wants some more sort of a spur growth through economic activity. So Yeah, the biggest threat to the European Union right now is between poor EU countries and rich ones, rather than nationalist or not nationalist. Diggs. The pro-monarchy nationalists are less anti-American, while the lefty nationalists are anti-American and anti-British. Yes, that's my understanding of it from what JJ has said. Yeah, it's like most of the Canadians I know personally are all in the YouTube world, and they're like either JJ or they're all a bunch of like NDPs. That seems to be the nature of most of the Canadians I know. So yeah, the One Hawks fan opinions on Alberta joining the U.S. I mean, I say when it comes to American manifest destiny, Western Canada is an underappreciated spot for expansion. Get those Western provinces. The funny thing is that a lot of the people in the Western provinces of Canada were actually American citizens about a century plus ago. A bunch of Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century immigrated to Western Canada because they had a lot of cheap land there. And so a lot of them moved up there. Of course, then again, a lot of those people who moved up into Western Canada in the late 19th and early 20th century from the United States were also socialists. So sorry about that, Canada. Let's see. Diggs. I see what's happening to the American Republican Party, similar to what happened to the Progressive Conservative Party up here. Would you agree with this? See, I would need to refresh myself on the Progressive Conservative Party from Canada. I would have to refresh myself on its history again. It's been a while since I did that. Let's see. Oh. All right, Gum Gum. Strange question. Would you say if Theodore Roosevelt had won a third term, would you say things would be more better than with Wilson kind of muddying up the waters? Well, I'm not entirely certain. Like Teddy Roosevelt would have gotten America involved in World War I quicker, and I don't know if that would actually have been better for the United States or not, or better for the world or not. I don't know. Would the war have been over sooner? Probably, but I don't know if that would have been for better or for worse. Like I know Alternate History Hub and Cynical Historian did their collaboration, and they think it definitely would have been better, but I'm not necessarily certain it would be, because a lot of the ideas of the Wilson administration didn't originate with Wilson. It was like a lot of the groundwork for it was laid by Theodore Roosevelt. The penchant for the penchant for military interventionism was definitely begun with Roosevelt. Let's see. Benjamin, do you think American Indian tribes in Oklahoma will push to have more sovereignty to the point they become independent nations, or do you think they will push for more right from the federal government? I think it's more likely the latter. More likely the latter, especially, after that recent ruling in Oklahoma. It's a very interesting one, but it's likely going to end up having to push Congress to resolve this. And if the Democrats win control of the Senate and the White House in November, I can see them, visiting the issue and, granting probably more economic stuff to the tribes, probably give them some more money and whatnot, reparations to the tribes, not to individual members in the tribes, as I talked about earlier. Let's see. So yeah, Vibrecht. How do you describe your channel to your parents, friends, spouse, and kids? Well, I don't have the last two, and the third to the last one is questionable. But to my parents, it's a lot easier to describe to my mom because she's more technologically savvy than my dad is. My dad just thinks I'm a teacher, basically. He thinks I'm a teacher just online. I then have to for my dad, I basically have to re-explain what I do over and over again. My mom gets it. She's just not as into YouTube as, I am, but that's to be expected. She's in her late 50s. I'm in my early 30s. That's to be expected. see. Lindsay Manning, how will people remember Sanders many years from now? I think Sanders will be thought of as kind of like a William Jennings Bryan type character, you know. He may very well be remembered as the person, like he's either going to be like a William Jennings Bryan or maybe even like a Barry Goldwater for the left. But that's going to depend a lot on how the next 4 to 8 years go, I think. Let's see. All right, people discussing the Canada stuff in the comments there. Let's see. Jacob Wilson. Do you think the amount of online leftists is deceptive in showing how many people support those ideas? Oh, most definitely. The internet has this amazing ability to distort reality and how many people actually support a thing. Like, hold on a second. Like, here's the thing. People are thinking, oh, like back 3 years ago or so, you know, there's this big sort of a hullabaloo about the right is taking over YouTube, when really it's not. No, like that whole like radicalization pipeline is kind of nonsense, really. The YouTube algorithm, even back then, had a tendency to push people towards watching left-wing content more so than right-wing content. The people who are watching far-right content were people who are already far right and wanted to look for that stuff. And so I don't think it was do that. But the internet has this ability to deceive people because like imagine, like, remember Charlottesville. There was like 500 people from around the country. They got 500 of these neo-Nazi types from around the entirety of the US to come to one place. Think how small that actually is. Like, if you divided that up between all 50 states, you know, that's not very many people per state. That's like you got 10 people a state on average that would have been there. And to put that in perspective, BronyCon had more people show up than the Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville. BronyCon, there are more basically, I am strongly convinced that there are more bronies in the United States than there are neo-Nazis. I'm not sure which one is more dangerous to the future of our republic, but that is just a statistical fact, I think. And Twitter also has this other idea, you know, like, I guess the ability of the internet to make you think that groups are bigger than they really are is the ability for all of them from all around the country or all around the world to feel like they're in one place at one time. You know, it's like, yeah, it's like I could post something controversial on Twitter and then 1,000 people believing something could all descend on me at once. And none of those 1,000 people have ever met. That's how distorting the internet is of real life. So yeah. All right. That one Hawks fan, do you think Greenland will be bought by the USA or is it just a dream? At the moment, I think it's just a dream. And unfortunately, I think Donald Trump talking about it made people not take it seriously, or that made them oppose it on principle because Trump liked the idea. But yeah, I think I would support buying Greenland, but I don't think it's in the cards right now. Let's see. Brit Boy, thoughts on Kanye West presidential run? Yeah, it's all about the memes for me, you know? It's all about the memes for Kanye. Let's see. Okay. All right, Jason, if the Democrats win the Senate and White House, will they try to pack the Supreme Court? That is a strong possibility. If they win the Senate and the White House and presumably retain control of Congress, yeah, them trying to pack the court is a serious possibility. It is a serious possibility, and we should be concerned. Because if we've already kind of done this, but with packing the court, it'll be risked even more. that we essentially just turn the Supreme Court into a third house of Congress. That's how we basically treat it now. And if we start packing the court, that's going to be what it becomes. Because, the Democrats will pack the court with however many additional members they'll need in order to win a majority. And then when the Republicans gain back control, they'll add seats to the court in order to win a majority. And it'll go back and forth like that to the point where you have, a Supreme Court with 100+ members on it functionally becoming a third house of Congress. Let's see. Brit Boy, the bronies are more dangerous. They are the punishment for being disloyal to the crown. Are there no bronies in the UK? Are there no bronies there? Not sure. Let's see. Gum Gum. Me and my boyfriend have been asking this, so I have to ask, do you think the English royal family should be disbanded? I think the royal family in the UK, what they do should be up to the UK itself. As an American, I have no say in that matter, and I quite frankly don't care. I find the institution of monarchy weird, but apparently other countries do fine with it. So, if it's one of those little quirks you guys have, so be it. None of my business. Let's see. Lindsay Manning, do you think Justin Trudeau will win the next Canadian election? Canadian prime ministers tend to serve like decade-long terms, my understanding is, and he's been in office since 2015. And so I think the next Canadian election is supposed to be it's scheduled for 2023, I think. And so he might win that one, or he might step down. It's a toss up, but then again, I don't know. I don't pay too much attention to the details on the ground of Canadian elections. It's like if JJ McCullough hasn't talked about it, I probably don't know about it yet. When it comes to Canadian politics. See, Casual Historian, removed from power. If you're talking about should the monarchs be removed from power, they kind of already are. I mean, they theoretically have power, but Parliament at this point also has the power to take them out of power if they decide to do something like that. Or at least that's my understanding. I could be wrong. I'm not a UK political expert, but that's been my understanding. And so, at least under the Queen Elizabeth II, there's been a tendency to not get involved in politics. Jacob Wilson, with the online leftist question, do you think it's partly because most Republicans or right-leaning people don't use the internet or don't know how to effectively? It's not that they don't use the internet. In fact, right-wingers are they tend to be very good at adopting to new media platforms. And the reason the right tends to be good at adopting to new media platforms is because they tend to not be kicked out of other platforms. Like the reason the right ended up going towards the radio is because newspapers, magazines, and regular television drove away all of their conservative writers. And if a bunch of conservatives are going to form some kind of new media outlet, they're going to be serving that conservative audience that wants a conservative, or sort of a dose of conservatism in all their news. And so that's kind of what happens. And so and that's another way, the right ended up embracing the internet, Glenn Beck is probably one of the biggest pioneers in terms of internet media companies. His The Blaze won a bunch of awards for that kind of stuff, and a bunch of other outlets followed his lead afterwards. The Daily Wire would not be a thing were it not for Glenn Beck's The Blaze, and a few other outlets wouldn't exist if it weren't for him. And so they're very good at adopting to new platforms. The problem, however, is that the right doesn't really bring in, they have a hard time bringing in outsiders onto their specific platforms. But it's partly also the fault of these progressive left-leaning owners of other more established platforms is that they keep driving the right wingers or conservatives off of them. And so it's kind of a two-way problem. It's a problem that exacerbates itself, basically. Let's see. Vibrecht asks, any opinion on the metric system? I'm fine using imperial units. It's not as confusing as people think it is. See ya. All right, people talking about Canadian politics in the chat. That's always interesting. Marcus Bisma, thought you were going to keep your beard until October for Octobeard. Nope. Yeah, the only reason I shaved the beard off was because a couple of weeks ago, I was doing some trimming, trying to clean it up a bit, and I accidentally shaved off too much on one side. And so I then tried to even it out on the other side, but evened out, it looked even worse. And so it's like, well, I can either sit here and wait for the parts to grow back in and have really bad looking facial hair, or I can just shave the whole thing off and start over. And so I chose the latter. See. Let's see. Brit Boy, thoughts on Falun Gong? They're probably oppressed in China, but then again, most religious groups are, and they are behind a lot of weird propaganda outlets. Once again, I cite JJ McCullough. He did a great video on Falun Gong. Actually, it's a couple videos on Falun Gong. Really good stuff there. Let's see. Gum Gum, not trying to compare U.S. stuff to other countries, but would you call New Zealand's voting system the best? Because articles like Vox seem to call it one. Yeah. Vox likes anything that they think will give sort of progressives an electoral advantage. That's mostly it. Otherwise, for its voting system, I'm not opposed to it. I just don't know if it's the be-all, end-all solution to political problems around the world. I think the way discourse happens means a lot more. Discourse and like the average person sort of education matters more. So yeah, Vibrecht, if you were eligible to get a pistol permit this month, which bullet would you want yours chambered for? I'm not actually that knowledgeable about like gun stuff, to be honest. I'm mostly knowledgeable on gun stuff when it comes to like gun rights. I'm not much when it comes to the technical aspects. Like, I have never fired a firearm that doesn't require black powder and a ramrod. So I have limited experiences with it comes to modern firearms. It's like the kind of firearm I have experience with is one that like none of the regulations that exist right now would impact at all. All right. Maximiliano Garcia Chiranos Maximiliano, what do you think is a good way to educate young people on capitalism and the free market economy? Well, I think a big way to do it is we need to sort of address the concepts of fairness, I think. A lot of people tend to, emphasize this idea of something is fair, or like fairness means equal outcome. And I think that's the big thing is you have to teach kids that, sometimes things don't come out evenly. And unevenness isn't inherently unjust. So that's the big first step is people need to think that unequal outcomes aren't inherently unjust. So yeah, Drew Drosky, have you heard of Tom Sowell? What do you think of him? I have heard of Thomas Sowell. I haven't read any of his books, but I'm very familiar with his reputation. I've been needing to read some of his stuff, and so I will get back to you as soon as I can. But I'm well aware of his he is very well received amongst libertarians and conservatives. But then again, libertarians and conservatives love them a black guy who's not a liberal or a progressive. Let's see. Marcus Bisma, what's your favorite election-related favorite movie? Mine probably The Manchurian Candidate. My favorite election movie is 2012's The Campaign, starring Will Ferrell and Zach Galifianakis. It is probably the most underrated political film ever, and probably the most underrated Will Ferrell and Zach Galifianakis movie. It is just brilliant. See, Lindsay Manning, what is the biggest misconception that left-leaning people have about anything? I would usually say it's something to do with economics, but I would have to take a lot more time to come up with something a little more thoughtful and sincere. It's mostly, I think, just due to instincts. They have different instincts than conservatives do. They far more prioritize sort of, like equity than the right does. And so it's kind of a values thing more than a inherently misunderstanding thing. That and the inability to separate like feelings towards a person versus what that person does. See, Gum again. What would you call the European Union? My boyfriend just thinks they're a wasted democracy. Also, is universal currency always a good thing? A universal currency is not always a good thing. It's not always a bad thing. Like back in the 19th century, early 20th century, there was the gold standard. The old classical gold standard was more or less a universal currency. All the countries that were using the gold standard set their value of their currency to a certain amount of gold, and then said, okay, if you come to our country and exchange, and this amount of gold, we'll give you this amount of our currency, and vice versa. And so it functioned as a kind of a global universal currency. It ends up being bad when, of course, when the single, like a universal currency in the hands of a bank or a treasury that decides to print a bunch of money uncontrollably, that's bad for everybody. It's like if you have a bunch of individual countries, each have their own bank, that each have their own central bank that prints their own currency. If one bank makes bad monetary policy decisions, it affects mostly just that country. If you have one central bank for an entire grouping of countries, bad monetary policy will impact all of them. But good monetary policy will also help most of them. And so that's always the worry about sort of uniting, tying people more together economically or apart. It all depends upon how good the policy is. And if there's a tendency for a certain group that makes bad policies to always be in control, then it ends up being a bad thing. Let's see. Lindsay Manning, what's the most overrated political movie? No idea, actually. Not sure. Medrano has a question. Super chat here. Let's see. Would it be better if the general public put more attention to state or local politics than federal? I think it would, but then again, I think the politics have become very nationally focused because that's what the media is. Because it's very hard for a local news outlet to be profitable just reporting on local news. There's just not enough money in your local market in your small town in a rural area to make it a profitable news enterprise. And the bigger up news enterprises, like CNN isn't going to pay much attention to a local election going on in a rural area unless it makes some kind of, rating sense. So that's why it's kind of hard. It's easier to make a lot of money talking about something that affects more people than it is talking about something that affects only a small number. And so that's one of the reasons why politics has become so national focused. It's like Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House under Reagan, used to say all politics was local, but that stopped being true about the time that he said that line. Because at this point, all politics is basically national. For better or for worse, it's all national now. Diggs, what do you think is the most harmful myth about the Soviet Union? Most harmful myth? I don't know. Like a cynical historian just released his, 10 myths about the Soviet Union, Soviet history. But I have to get back to you on that, what the most harmful myth about the Soviet Union is. I have to get back to you on that. Jacob Wilson, what is your opinion on welfare in America? Should it be reformed or just gotten rid of? Here's the thing. A younger, more ideologically stringent me would have definitely said, abolish it. But an older me is thinking like, well, as much as I ideologically oppose its existence, getting rid of it all at once is not practical. So I would favor a kind of like a gradual abolition of it while simultaneously also promoting like changes in the economy that would allow people to procure the same kinds of services that welfare provided in a more, make it provide it more easily. So make it easier for people to get jobs, make it easier for people to get insurance, make it easier for people to get healthcare within the private sector. Because there's a bunch of stuff that gets in the way of that. So you can't just have one or the other. You kind of need both to happen at once. Cheesem asks, thought on the Yang General McRaven ticket. I thought Yang had dropped out and endorsed Biden. So I don't think he's on a ticket. Maybe not. I don't know. See, Fat Boy Fitness. Will masks be a debate issue? Will there be debates? I think there will be debates. I don't know if masks will be. If it is, it's mostly going to be the host asking them to talk about what they've done about masks. Diggs. Yeah, a lot of the bad myths are remnants of Nazi propaganda. Yes and no. Here's the thing. A lot of Nazi propaganda about the Soviet Union is actually kind of derived from Tsarist era propaganda. So it's a little more complicated than that. But, I'd love to talk about that at some point, just not at this moment. Let's see. We are nearing the 2-hour mark, so I think I'm going to about call it. So if there are any last questions, send them in now. All right, Gum, last question from you. What would you say one thing fiction tends to get the most wrong about politics? The thing fiction tends to get most wrong about politics is this idea that it's some massive conspiracy. Basically, I think fiction has a tendency to think politicians are more competent than they really are. It's like, are politicians more like House of Cards, or are they more like Veep? And I think I lean more towards politicians are more like the Veep end of the spectrum. All right, and Christian Vibrecht. All right, I think this will be the last question here. Any idea how can Greece and Italy be conceived to become libertarian countries? They are not capable of managing robust governments. Yeah, it's like, I remember back in the 2010s, I watched Glenn Beck a lot back in the early 2010s, and he had guests on from like what they called the European Tea Party movement. And it had trouble getting started up in countries like Italy and Greece because they don't really have a tradition of small government. And that's kind of the big issue, is that they don't have traditions of libertarian policies or small government policies. And so it would be very hard for a country like Greece or Italy to do that. So you would need to have a massive cultural change in those countries before that could be possible. And with that, I think I'll be calling it quits here. Thank you guys so much for joining the stream. Looks like we had a higher average view duration here. So it looks like future streams I will probably do in the afternoons rather than the evenings, or at least afternoons my time. So thank you guys so much for coming by, and I think I will end it here.